Now, let's move on to the next chapter, where we will explore in depth David Icke's most influential source. They tell him what to write, what to say, what to wear, what to believe and what not to believe, and he calls them the guys.
The beings which we call the guys told us about.
You call them the guys?
The guys, yeah.
But the beings like
Tarot,
Rakowski.
and yeah, that's right.
It's highly likely that I'm something to do with the whole process because I'm interviewing you.
Well, it's difficult because I need to check all this out because you're throwing this at me and I need to sit down and check this out with the guys. But I would said that you were certainly involved in a great chance of being involved at that time.
David often says that these beings have always guided him. It was the same beings that originally contacted him that are still guiding him.
Well, yeah, I've been on a long journey of nearly 20 years now, consciously doing this, and some force has been pushing me in different directions.
In Love Changes Everything, he says, those who are helping the planet and humanity through this crucial period in their evolution, they have asked me to put together in this book all that I have learned so far. And that, quote, communicating with such beings on other levels of creation is the most natural thing in the world. When he describes how it is that this communication with the guys takes place, he says, quote, this process is called channeling. The thought forms can be turned into written words. This is known as automatic writing. Your hand writes on the paper, sometimes with incredible speed, but the words and information are not yours and could not possibly be yours because you often know nothing about the subjects taking shape in front of you. It is also possible to hear the thought forms as a soft, gentle voice inside your head. I call this method getting it direct. On a more limited level, it is possible to communicate through dowsing.
Perhaps.
Do you actually hear the voices in your head?
It depends. Sometimes you hear voices, sometimes it comes in terms of them talking through you, so they talk through your voice box. And it also comes through what's known as automatic writing. You get a sheet of paper, you put a pen in your hand, and they just take over your arm, they write. And they write amazing things which you have no comprehension of. I mean,
he also still quotes from them from time to time as evidence that he still considers the information accurate. An example is that he closes most of his lectures with a quote from a being named Magnu from his book Love Changes Everything. And he says that his words are really their words.
And wonder where they came from. They will be our words.
These beings, as we saw in the first chapter, dictated the belief system of theosophy to him. And although he does not call it that today, it is clear that that's what it is. Given what we learned in the first section about the connection to Alice Bailey, who also was in contact with entities, how can we be sure that Icke is not listening to the wrong spiritual forces, the ones that seem to be orchestrating the New World Order? He's the first to admit that these beings exist. We can gain some wisdom from a man some of you may know named Terence McKenna. He was a man who encountered several beings from other dimensions, according to his books. He had some sobering words for people like David Icke when he said, it is no great accomplishment to hear a voice in the head. The accomplishment is to make sure it is telling the truth, because the demons are of many kinds. There is no dignity in the universe unless we meet these things on our feet, and that means having an I-thou relationship. One say to the other, you say you're omniscient, omnipresent, or you say you're from Zeta Reticuli. You're long in the talk, but what can you show me? Magicians, people who invoke these things, have always understood that one must go into such encounters with one's wits about oneself. You can get a few things from this quote. Number one, McKenna believed that extra-dimensional entities were prone to lying about their identities. And number two, they were able to be summoned in magic rituals. And number three, that they don't necessarily have our best interest in mind, although they always would present it in that way in order to be trusted or to get us to do whatever they wanted us to do. I find it very interesting that McKenna said that the same entities that don't need to be trusted are the same ones that occultists summon in rituals. Although McKenna seemed to know that these entities were deceptive, he still sought contact with them, and he even attributed his amazing ability to speak eloquently to possession by one of them. He says, after the experiment at La Correa, I had apparently evolved into some sort of mouthpiece for the incarnate Logos. I could talk to small groups of people with what appeared to be electrifying effect about peculiarly transcendental matters that you will read about in these pages. It was as though my ordinary, rather humdrum personality had simply been turned off and speaking through me was the voice of another, a voice that was steady, unhesitating, and articulate, a voice seeking to inform others about the power and promise of psychedelic dimensions. From my study of the 2012 phenomenon, I have seen that these entities are very interested in getting people to go out and spread the idea that a spiritual evolution is coming. And like McKenna warned us about, they pretend to be all kinds of things in order to get us to tell their story. For instance, all the main forerunners of the 2012 idea got their revelation about 2012 and spiritual evolution from spiritual entities, claiming to be different things. Jose Arguelles got his information from a long-dead Mayan priest. Jose actually now changed his name to reflect that he believes himself to be a reincarnation of that Mayan priest. McKenna got his 2012 information from a being he calls the Logos, Pinchback from a being called Quetzalcoatl, David Wilcock from the Egyptian god Ra, Barbara Han Clow from the Pleiadians. I might have even been able to believe that these entities were good and were simply giving the same message under different names just to make the message easy for the person to handle, if it weren't for the fact that all the information they gave about astronomy and science was so wrong. For instance, David Icke in his book, And the Truth Shall Set You Free, talks about the, quote, photon belt. Keep in mind while we read this, that this information is 100% channeled information originally. None of it is real science, and we will see how wrong this theory is in a moment. He begins, underpinning these astrological events in this period is the photon belt. Many psychics and esoteric scientists, notice how he didn't say actual scientists or astronomers, are now agreed on the existence of a belt of highly charged energy, centered on the Pleiades star system, an estimated 500 light-years from the Earth. It is from here that much channeled information which feels right to me is purported to come. I believe that the Pleiades, maybe in our future, is a base for the positive extraterrestrial support we are being given at this time, and quite possibly the home of extraterrestrials who have abused the Earth and humanity too. Paul Otto Hesse claimed to have discovered a belt of immensely powerful energy which he termed the photon belt. According to estimates, it takes his solar system 24,000, some say 26,000 years to orbit the Pleiades, and the star reckoned to be at the center of the belt, figure 17, known as Alcyon. Again, there is much ancient legend across many cultures about this star. He continues, it would appear that we have reached the point when this solar system is entering the photon belt and its highly charged energy. The influence of the belt on the Earth began in the early 1960s and affected the thinking of many people, but it was as nothing compared to what will happen over the next 35 years. While it takes 2,000 years to pass fully through the belt, the biggest impact is when we first enter, and the vibrations and molecular structure of everything has to cope with the dramatically changing conditions. This will affect the thinking, behavior, and physical bodies of all life forms. He concludes by saying the effect of the photon belt is activating data stored in our consciousness and our physical bodies. He says knowledge is being unlocked from the cells, bones, and our DNA, which will eventually be restored to its 12-stranded potential. Now you can see that if this were true, it would be a great find to support the idea of a coming spiritual evolution that Icke and Alice Bailey and Michael Tsarian and all these spiritual entities are trying to get us to believe. But the problem is that all this science that these entities told us is not true. Even the basic math shows this to be impossible. Our solar system and that of Alcyon are both orbiting around the galactic center. It takes us about 226 million years to go around one time, and that's at 486,000 miles per hour. If our solar system was also orbiting around Alcyon while it was also revolving around the center of the galaxy, it would need to be going much faster than the speed in which we are currently moving. One scientist said it this way. The math doesn't work, he says. Alcyon is 400 light years from Earth. If the Sun was orbiting Alcyon in 250,000 years, it would have to have an orbital speed of 3,142 kilometers a second, which is 14 times faster than the Sun is currently orbiting the galactic center. This would be readily apparent if it were so. Another way of expressing this is that if the Sun was orbiting Alcyon at the same speed as it goes around the galactic center, and if there were such a lesser orbit that it would probably be much slower, then it would take either 3.5 million years instead of 250,000 years, or Alcyon would have to be only 28 light years from Earth instead of 400. Besides, our movement has been measured against the background of stars on numerous occasions, and scientists have found no trace of such an orbit. And this is only the beginning of this theory's problems. Alcyon and the Pleiades cluster are stars no more than 100 million years old, 1/40th the age of the Earth, much younger than our solar system. Alcyon would not even have been there when our Sun began such an orbit, and that in itself is a pretty persuasive argument against this theory. And the so-called anomaly in the Pleiades cluster is a nebula. It's made up of plasma and gas, not photons. Photons are light, and light doesn't gather in clouds like that. Nebulas are remnants of supernovas, and they diffuse over time, and therefore wouldn't even be expected to be there if we were orbiting it in a cycle of 26,000 years. The core of the Pleiades cluster is approximately 8 light years across. The Sun, and with it the Earth, is moving away from Alcyon. This should be the final nail in the coffin of this theory. So, these entities are either really bad with science, or they are intentionally deceiving us to believe in a Hitler-esque fifth root race spiritual evolution. We will look at the possible motives for that theory in the next and final section. But for now, I want to propose a theory about what these beings are. Most of you will recoil at my suggestion that these are demons. But before you do, I think that the science of anthropology will help us to see that every culture has agreed on demons existing and on their basic characteristics. For instance, of them being very evil. For example, the Sumerians could not even agree if their gods were good or evil, but they were unanimous that the demons they dealt with were very evil. Cultures around the world have described possession by these evil entities in their writings, as well as demons being very deceptive and manipulative. The methods for summoning them are consistent. Certain drugs or rituals or tools like runes or chants. It's interesting to note that the methods for making contact are ultimately based on the free will of the practitioner. What I mean by that is that according to basic demonology, demons require an invitation, although they sometimes manipulate the person through deception into giving them that invitation. Take a Ouija board, for example. It's just cardboard and paint, but those that decide to use it are essentially asking to be contacted by spirits, and that's all the spirits need, your willingness to be contacted, your free will. So let's look at David's testimony to see if we can get any idea if he's dealing with demons instead of ascended Atlanteans trying to help humanity evolve.
Suddenly I felt over 1989 that there was a presence in the room whenever I was alone. And it became more and more tangible as 1989 unfolded. It was bizarre, really, because whenever I was in a room alone, like a hotel room or something, there was this presence, you know. And eventually it got so powerful towards the end of '89 that I was sitting on the side of a bed in a hotel called the Kensington Hilton in London, just down from the BBC headquarters. And I said to this apparently empty room, look, if there's something there, would you please contact me, because you'll drive me up the wall.
Let's stop right there for now. Notice how all this began with a desire to be contacted. Also note that David will later go on to basically preach that this is all that must be done for anyone to be contacted.
All we've got to say, and it's very simple, is I accept that I'm being guided. I have guides in other frequencies, other dimensions of life, who are here to guide me and help me through this lifetime so that I learn the lessons I decided I wish to learn. Go ahead and guide me. And when you do that, things start happening.
He says on page 139 of Love Changes Everything, quote, every single life form can be a part of this transformation if they say openly, I wish to be guided and work for the light. Notice that he capitalizes the word light. On page 156, he quotes the entities which told him, quote, always ask for protection and guidance. Ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. But then they say, you must make the first move. You need to exercise your free will. They tell him at the end of the book, quote, welcome all beings. If you do this, you're welcoming creation into your life. It is also interesting to note the negative effect that even pictures of Jesus began to have on him. In his book Truth Vibrations, he says this about a visit he made to a church as a tourist. Quote, looking up at a large painting of Christ, the picture suddenly turned black and moved around before my eyes. Only the face of Christ was still. Suddenly, I felt a sensation I can only describe as someone pushing a pneumatic drill into the top of my head. I gripped the pew I was standing beside, and my body vibrated from the top of my head to the base of my spine as something seemed to go through me. He says that months later, he was told that he received a gift of energy from one of the ascended masters of the planetary system at this point. Interesting that revulsion towards Jesus is actually quite observable among these entities. I would even go so far as to say that it's empirically testable in our modern times. I've had a unique opportunity to work with hundreds of cases of sleep paralysis through a website a friend and I started called StopSleepParalysis.org. Sleep paralysis is when one wakes up and can't move, but they are fully awake. It is most often associated with the feeling that there is some evil presence in the room. Over time, during the experiences, the presence can become more manifest in some form and can lead to very terrible cases of torture and even rape. This is attributed to demons in almost every culture in the world except for modern Western cultures like America. A few examples are in Fiji. The experience is interpreted as kana tevoro, or being eaten or possessed by a demon. In the Hmong culture, sleep paralysis is described as an experience called dab swam, or crushing demon. In Malaysia, Africa, Hungary, the Middle East, and everywhere in between, these events are attributed to evil spirits. Western scientists do not have an explanation. They postulate, with no evidence I would add, that it is happening because people are coming out of a dream state and into a waking state, and that their mind is still dreaming even though they have awoken. I suppose the obvious question is, if that were true, why does everyone seem to be having the same dream about an evil presence in the room? It seems that the dreams should be as varied as the dreams normally are among people, but this is not the case. In the cases that I have seen, about 90 to 95% of the people experiencing this have been dabbling in some occult or New Age practice, and they have in some way given their free will over to these entities, who now apparently feel that they have a right to be there. The more a person goes down that road, the more intense the control of these entities gets. Now here is the observable and testable part of this. If a person genuinely calls upon Jesus for help, the experience will immediately stop. Very often, the entities will scream or be thrown back. One of the interesting aspects to this is it doesn't appear that a person has to be a Christian to do this, or to have previously believed that Jesus was important in some way. In fact, as you can guess, many of the people who are getting this are not Christians at all. But most of them who do see this authority that the name of Jesus has over these beings that they've been dealing with for so long, do begin to research who he is and why his name is so important. Now this doesn't work with other names, interestingly. For instance, calling on Buddha, no matter how sincere the person is, doesn't seem to concern these entities. There would be another time in Icke's life when he would vibrate uncontrollably like he did when looking at that picture of Jesus. This was when he took his infamous trip to Peru. He tells the story this way.
I had this overwhelming feeling, again, the urge, the impulse, to go to Peru. We got to this place, and it's in the middle of nowhere. And basically, when you looked around, it was encircled by mountains, in the distance, mind. And I'm looking out the window, daydreaming, and I see this mound to my right, but must be no more than 3 minutes down the road. And as I look at the mound, all I can hear in my head is, come to me, come to me, come to me, come to me, come to me. And I walk to the center of the circle, and suddenly my feet go again, like they did in the news shot, but only seriously more powerful. They're like magnets pulling my feet to the ground. And I think, oh crikey, I recognize that, here we go. And then I felt like a drill going in the top of my head and through my body, through my feet into the ground, and then another one coming the other way. And then my arms go out at 45 degrees like that. I never made any decision to do it. And what then started to happen is this energy coming through me, this is February 1991, got more and more powerful. My body started to shake with it. Very powerful thought forms just passed through my head, just like in the news shot. It was like, you know, if you've got a dam and it's holding water back, well, the water is calm, right? Because that's its natural state in that situation, if you like. But when the dam bursts, before a new balance is found after the dam bursts, all hell breaks loose in the water. right, as it's trying to go from one state to another.
Yep.
When I look back, what happened to me on that mound? It was like the waters of my mind bursting.
Icke always attributes this event to this place in Peru being located near a vortex point in something he calls the energy grid. But there is another side to that story. I used to believe in the idea of ley lines myself. I had no reason to doubt it. After all the so-called teachers I had in the truth movement talked about it as if it was a long-established fact. But I encourage anyone to do some research about how this idea started and see if you can still force yourself to believe it after that. There is actually a very interesting history of its evolution, and I will provide links in the notes where you can get all the details on this to get you started with the research. I say this because many people will claim that a proof that a ley line exists is the fact that certain places, especially ancient ritual sites, have a very heavy feeling of energy. I would validate that, but let me offer an alternate theory, one that I think is based on a much more observable cause. Icke would say that the reason that people were sacrificing on these ancient sites is because they were on powerful spots in the energy grid, and these people were adding negativity to it to affect world consciousness, and that's why the place feels negative. But I would say, based on my understanding of satanic rituals, that the areas are not intrinsically special at all. It is simply by it being the place where a lot of blood is spilled in sacrifice that it draws the presence of these evil spirits to the place. And that is why the area feels negative, as a result of their presence. Let me see if my theory helps us to understand what happened to Icke in Peru. But first let me describe a little about the area that he was visiting. The area that Icke was in was known for its blood sacrifice. New human sacrificial sites turn up all the time in Peru from the pre-Incan and Incan civilizations, especially that of small children. In fact, the place that Icke talks about in this clip was a place called Silistani, where there are stone channels that lead down to the lake so that the blood of the sacrifices could flow from the sacrificial site to the lake. Ironically, there is also a lizard engraved at the site too, and they still sacrifice pregnant iguanas there to this day. There is a stone circle on the mound there, which is exactly like the one 3 minutes down the road where Icke says his Kundalini experience was. This area was full of these stone circles on mounds, and I would suggest to you, based on his description of his convulsions and on him hearing voices of beings in his head on a daily basis after this, that he was further controlled by the entities at this point. Then there is the story of his experience in Brazil with the drug ayahuasca.
In 2003, when I had an ayahuasca experience in Brazil, and a voice talked to me for 5 hours about the nature of reality. Real clear, very funny, and mind-blowing and life-changing.
Ayahuasca is a DMT-containing drug, which is naturally produced in the pineal gland, and is present in wild plants found in places like the Amazon basin, and has been used for millennia by Aboriginal shamans and medicine men to contact the spirit world and to receive information from entities there. It is common for adjoining DMT partakers to see the same apparition. Psychologist Dr. Rick Strassman conducted a formal clinical study of DMT ingestion under the auspices of the University of New Mexico, which he detailed in his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. He found, under controlled clinical conditions, that subjects had these experiences within seconds of ingesting DMT, which almost universally mimicked what are described elsewhere as alien abduction events. Note that these subjects were screened to be those who were not familiar with stories of UFOs or did not believe in them. The entities they encountered were typically described as traditional greys, reptilian, or insect-like. The context usually involved medical and reproductive experiments conducted by the entities on the subjects, described as violent rape episodes. When subjects were willing to try additional experiences, they reported that the entities acknowledged their prior disappearance with no sensation of time loss. The episodes were so traumatic to the subjects that a support group was later formed to help them deal with the emotional trauma of the experiences. I would ask you to remember the quote from Terence McKenna warning us about these entities. He had more experience with this drug than most people, and as much as he enjoyed talking about it, Recall that he always described the so-called elves he came into contact with as, quote, mischievous, which is a more sugar-coated version of the descriptions that I have heard from people who have taken it, who simply call these beings evil. And I'm sure not everybody's experience is bad, but here's the question we should ask about these entities that show up when we take drugs like this. Should we assume that the entities that are talking about love are good? Or based on the fact that the negative ones obviously exist and are contacted by the exact same means, can we be skeptical of the positive ones as well? In fact, how do we know that the so-called good ones we encounter aren't simply pretending to be good? Especially, as in Icke's case, if the voice is clearly describing the same doctrine that Alice Bailey's ascended masters have been trying to teach us from the beginning, this idea of spiritual evolution. I think that the biggest problems we have in the truth movement are, one, we have no idea that everything we believe, we were made to believe by people carrying the message of these entities. And two, because we don't really understand what their end game is, or why they are so diligent with this deception, it makes us powerless to defend against it. We don't even know what it is they're trying to ultimately do. We find ourselves wanting to believe what they want us to believe, and we never have realized that we are being led like sheep to the slaughter to what I like to call the New World Order. Let me introduce you to the real plan of the Illuminati. The one thing that has never changed in Icke's teaching is the idea of the coming evolution of humanity.
One of the themes at that time, we're talking 1990, was that there was a consciousness shift coming. I kept meeting psychic people a lot in those days, and they kept saying, I'm getting something, I'm being told to tell you this, and again it was, there's a consciousness shift coming. There is an awakening coming. And now as the 90s have become the new century, more and more this stuff about this shift is going on.
This also happens to be the central thesis to Theosophy, the mother of the New Age movement. In fact, the very term New Age is referring to a coming time of spiritual evolution. This fact alone should show you how the idea of a spiritual evolution is the only idea that matters to these beings. We've already looked at some of the reasons why Icke thinks the idea of a coming spiritual evolution is valid. One is because he believes the photons from the photon belt will change us, and alternatively, he believes that the galactic logos will send its 7 rays through the sun god and change our DNA into a better evolution. Despite these flimsy premises, Icke is absolutely convinced that nothing can stop this from happening.
I'm absolutely convinced that the end of this prison society is a done deal. I think the outcome is going to happen. I think it's meant to happen. And we're now seeing, and it will go on for a while, but we're now seeing the last throes of a dying system.
You also have to understand that we are being promised a utopia in no uncertain terms. He says, quote, "Beyond the turmoil of transformation awaits a new dawn for all life forms on this planet. We will live in a world of love and peace and harmony, a world which the extremes of today and the recent past will give way to a level of understanding, wisdom, love that we could not begin to understand on this low and troubled frequency." The first problem that emerges is that this is sounding a lot like what those that write about a New World Order talk about. In fact, this chapter comes from a chapter entitled New World in Icke's Love Changes Everything. But what some people miss is that the New World Order really does plan to bring order out of chaos. It is supposed to rise out of the ashes of what will appear to be a great change in paradigm. That is why Manly P. Hall called it the New Atlantis. They intend for their system to look like a utopia, and they intend for people who currently fight them and resist world government to think that the old system that they have been fighting has been defeated, and they intend for them to embrace what will look like a utopia and their victory. Alice Bailey said it best when she wrote, "The New World Order must be appropriate to a world which has passed through a destructive crisis and to humanity which is badly shattered by the experience. The New World Order must lay the foundation for a future world order which will be possible only after a time of recovery, reconstruction, and of rebuilding." Notice in this next quote that she considers the current system, which is obviously still controlled by them, just the preparatory New World Order. She says, in the preparatory period for the New World Order, there will be a steady and regulated disarmament. It will not be optional. No nation will be permitted to produce and organize any equipment for destructive purposes or to infringe the security of any other nation. She also says, the present world order, which is today largely disorder, can be so modified and changed that a new world and a new race of men can gradually come into being. Renunciation and the use of the sacrificial will should be the keynote for the interim period after the war, prior to the inauguration of the new age. In a writing called Preparations Until 2025, she made some very revealing statements. She says, this must form the theme of all propaganda work to be done during the next few decades until the year 2025, a brief space of time indeed to produce fundamental changes in human thought, awareness, and direction, but at the same time, a quite possible achievement provided the new group of world servers and the men and women of goodwill perform a conscientious task. What was this new group supposed to teach? I find this one particularly interesting. It says, the day is dawning when all religions will be regarded as emanating from one great spiritual source. All will be seen as unitedly providing the one root out of which the universal world religion will inevitably emerge. And this final quote that I find particularly interesting, considering that it is the one thing that Icke has consistently done through every manifestation. The last few pages of every book that he has ever written explains this message, the one that Alice Bailey says emphasis must be put on. She says, quote, emphasis should be laid on the evolution of humanity. There is also a very dark side to Icke's spiritual utopia, something that I've previously only alluded to. Not everyone is invited to the utopia, and those that refuse to conform to this new system will be eliminated. This is much more apparent when you read other channeled writings about this. In the book of Co-Creation, New Age leader Barbara Marx Hubbard states, quote, out of the full spectrum of human personality, 1/4 is electing to transcend. 1/4 is resisting to election. They are unattracted by life ever evolving. Now, as we approach the quantum shift from creature human to co-creative human, the destructive 1/4 must be eliminated from the social body. Fortunately, you, dearly beloveds, are not responsible for this act. We are. We are in charge of God's selection process for the planet Earth. He selects, we destroy. We are the riders of the pale horse death. Alice Bailey explained what the New World Order would do to those who refuse to accept its utopia. She says, let us never forget that it is the life, its purpose, and its directed intentional destiny that's of importance, and also that when a form proves inadequate, or too diseased or too crippled for the expression of that purpose, it is, from the point of view of the hierarchy, no disaster when that form has to go. Death is not a disaster to be feared. The work of the destroyer is not really cruel or undesirable. Therefore, there is much destruction permitted by the custodians of the plan, and much evil turned to good. In his chapter New World, Icke says, I do not seek to hide the severity of this period of fundamental change. It will be tough for every one of us. Many will return to the light levels, or die, in the wake of the physical events and the quickening vibrations. The Earth Spirit is already raising up the subplanes, and through the years ahead she will progress through the whole frequencies in her journey back to Atlantis and beyond. Those who cannot quicken their own vibrations through love and balance will find themselves out of synchronization with the environment around them. This process is already apparent. As the vibrations of a being fall behind those of their planet, it manifests in physical, mental, and emotional imbalances, and such people will need all the love there is to give. Their behavior will be unpredictable, and sometimes unpleasant and inexplicable. Those who cannot at this time rise with the climbing subplanes and frequencies will eventually return to the light levels, or die, and be surrounded by love and indescribable warmth and power. They will assess their progress and decide how they wish to proceed on their path of evolution. Icke also says later in the book, And the Truth Shall Set You Free, quote, Others who follow the propaganda of the global elite and the prison warder consciousness will cling to the old vibration. In their desperation to find security, they will become even more vehement in their religious, political, and economic dogma. They will resist the rising vibrations if they choose that path, and this will have mental, emotional, and physical effects. The two states of being, the programmed mind and the open mind, will be more obvious with every month to those who know what's happening. And not just that, but according to Icke, these people that are hanging on to the old age are going to actually prevent the rest of the people from getting their evolution. He says, quote, "We are now entering a period of fantastic change, and the happening of events are speeding up all the time. We have two challenges here in front of us. People have to get access to that information and start to realize who they really are and the nature of life. Then we can go into a stage 2, which is the incredible consciousness shift that is going to happen and is happening with many people already, but can happen for everybody if we open up to the knowledge of what's going on. And to do that, the edifice of suppression must go." What I see so often in the New Age movement is that they are focusing on the second, but they're in denial of the first. And the second is not going to happen for many people unless we remove the suppression. Now here's a thought that has disturbed me for a while now. Obviously, the idea of spiritual evolution is being pushed by the global elite and these entities. And I suppose that it could lead to a world government, but only if the entire world was in on it. What I mean is that right now, only the New Age and the so-called truth movement, which has now been converted to the New Age, believe the spiritual evolution stuff. And sure, the idea is expanding, thanks to shock value things like the 2012 stuff, but still, it would have to be believed by the entire world, not just a few. They would have to be passionate about the idea of spiritual evolution for this to work. Now, let Mr. Icke explain how this could all change overnight.
What I would say very strongly, and it's coming more and more into my life, there is an X factor which I don't understand yet, but I sure as hell know is there. And it's an X factor which is going to bring an end to this childish playground nonsense of human control.
Do you mean an external influence?
There's something. I absolutely, at a deep level, I know it. I'd say, and I'm probably being optimistic, I'd say we would live in a global version of Nazi Germany within 10 years, if we take that route. Mm-hmm. If we take that route, we'll, in 10 years' time, be deeply into a transition to a very different world. It's just a choice. But this X factor is going to help us to change the world to one that I would like to live in. Don't know what the X factor is, but I know it's coming.
No one's going to do it for us, right?
Well, my feeling is that there's an X factor. I don't think myself that humanity can do it alone, because the program is so deep and the pressure to go the other way, to hold on to the hack, is so powerful to people who are in mind alone, that I think what we can do is change enough so that we stop adding to the problem. But I think there's an X factor, I think. And I think that there are things going on now outside of our awareness and on much higher levels of consciousness than we're aware of, which is also supporting this change.
Notice what the function of the X factor is. He says that the programming to hold us all into the old ways is too strong. But the X factor, this external thing, will shatter that paradigm and set us free from our old way of thinking, and it will give us a new paradigm. Let me suggest a possible X factor that people like Bill Cooper have suggested, and one that I think, without question, we are being prepared for by the global elite, and have been for at least 70 years. That is, an extraterrestrial presence being discovered. Now, I realize that Cooper presented documents that reveal a plan of the New World Order to use an alien threat to cause patriotism needed for world government. After all, people would no longer view themselves as separate countries, but instead a world family. Now, this would also create the need for a world bureaucracy to deal with the threat. But I think that based on the propaganda of Hollywood and the occult writings, that this might not be presented as a threat at all, but rather them posing as a savior to a world that will be war-torn. They will claim to be saving us from ourselves. They would claim to have genetically created mankind. They would claim that they used to be like us, and that we are on the verge of an evolution. Now, suspend your disbelief for a moment as I explain how this would serve as Icke's X factor and the catalyst for his utopia, and the real New World Order to begin, all at the same time. First, it would accomplish the primary thing that Icke says we need to do in order to shift with the planet. That is, to destroy the religions of all types. All over the world, religions would be in turmoil. Here these aliens are claiming to have created us. That means they're claiming to be our God in a sense. Overnight, the programming that Icke says is too powerful, the religious programming that is holding us back from the shift, would be shattered. All the religions would be forced to reconsider their ideas. Secondly, it would finally get the idea of a possible spiritual evolution to the entire world. Everyone across the world, from the smallest village to the largest city, would have a really good reason to believe that they too could be evolved. They could become like the aliens. They could become actual gods. Overnight, the X Factor could turn the entire world into little David Ickes, believing their evolution was just around the corner. And of course, people would believe that the world government utopia was possible then. But it would be best if this came after a time of war, like when Alice Bailey said that the New World Order must be appropriate to a world which has passed through a destructive crisis and to a humanity which is badly shattered by the experience. Now here's why. We need to be convinced that the utopia that we will be asked to join is totally different than the old system. For us truther types, we will need to be convinced that the New World Order has been defeated in order to trust such a utopia. The regular people will only have to be convinced that the new system, since it will be based on non-religious ideas now, because the aliens showed us that the religions were wrong, will be one where there will be no more wars. That will be the promise. The war that we were saved from initially by them must be made to look like the epitome of religious wars. It will be something that pins the Jews against the Muslims, which will draw in the so-called Christians. The world will be convinced that the previous war was all about religion. Our revulsion of that idea and our desire never to go back to it will be like the Treaty of Versailles times 100. Alice Bailey said, "Only universal disaster could have brought men to a state of mind wherein such propositions and solutions could be presented. The general recognition that the old order has lamentably failed is most valuable. The New World Order will seem to have been defeated. We will rejoice in our new hope of utopia, and we will badly need it. We will be told to await our newfound powers, but when they don't come, we will be told that it is because there are some still among us that are keeping us from it, those that are still hanging on to the old age." All of this makes what Icke says in this clip very concerning.
But we're now seeing the last throes of a dying system where the Illuminati in their box are believing they're crashing the system to create something else, when it's actually crashing ultimately for another reason.
Understand what he's saying here. He's admitting that they are crashing the system to create something else. This idea should be common knowledge to all of us who study them. They are going to be the solution to the problem that they create. And Icke, of course, knows this. After all, he's Mr. Problem Reaction Solution. But listen carefully to what he's saying. He believes that his utopia will arise out of their ashes. And for some reason, their utopia won't rise. In effect, he is saying that when the system crashes, he is expecting his utopia to rise, but they are expecting a utopia to rise too. Now, how are we supposed to know that the utopia we get after this crash is the one that Icke is talking about, instead of the one that they've been planning to bring about for so long? Or probably the better question is, are these utopias one and the same thing? they certainly sound the same. What a dangerous game this is. They will say that there are still people who don't trust this new utopia, and that they will have to be eliminated for everyone else's benefit. These people will be primarily Christians, because there are prophecies specifically mentioning a great deception that will seem to offer peace, but that it will only last 3.5 years before it shows its true colors. All the other religions will find it easy to agree with this new system. This, in addition to the propaganda that Christianity is behind all the wars of the past, will convince the entire world of these words of Aleister Crowley, who was given this message from a being claiming to be an Egyptian god. Quote, "But the future is now, and the maneuvers are being unveiled. As far as Christianity's role in this new age," Carpenter states, "Christianity, therefore, as I say, must either now come frankly forward and acknowledge its parentage from the great order of the past, seek to rehabilitate that, and carry mankind one step forward in the path of evolution, or else it must perish. There is no alternative. Or, as New Age author Eckhart Tolle likes to say, evolve or die." We've been told by Icke, a man definitely possessed by something, that if we worship the God of the Bible, we are worshiping reptilians.
And when you worship, you project energy, and you are feeding this force by thinking you are worshipping a God when you're worshipping these.
He has changed his mind in every book that he's written about which way to tell you not to look towards Jesus and not to look at the Bible. His entities have told him to tell us that demons don't exist. The voice that talked to him for 5 hours in Brazil went on quite a tirade about how demons don't exist. How could they, after all, if everything was an illusion? There is a fabulous reason why this misdirection is happening, because the real agenda is being played out like a military system. These demons are influencing people to prepare the way for what the New World Order calls its phoenix, and what the Theosophical Society calls the world teacher, their Christ, what I would call the Antichrist. A genuine Satanist knows exactly what I'm talking about right now, and that this plan has been the plan all along. They are awaiting something they call the Black Awakening, when this system of the Antichrist will begin. Alice Bailey said, "The widespread expectation that we approach the age of Maitreya, when the world teacher and present head of the spiritual hierarchy, the Christ, will reappear among humanity to sound the keynote of the new age. There are millions of mentally alert men and women in all parts of the world who are on rapport with the plan and work to give it expression. They provide opportunity for cooperation with the spiritual evolution of humanity. There is no group so likely to ensure that humanity achieves this most difficult goal as the men and women of goodwill, requiring only courage to initiate action to prepare for the New World Order. All the conspiracies, all of them, are leading up to one event. There is an ancient angel that has been working on a system that would allow him to actually control the world to such a degree that he could force them to worship him as God. And unfortunately, for the first time in history, technology is now capable of doing that. I believe that the implantable microchip could actually play a role in this worship. And he is the general in all of this. This is why you find Satanism behind every door you kick down in the investigation of the New World Order. This is why you find his demons telling people to go out on a world stage and teach a doctrine that will lead them right into his hands, to an elitist mindset, seeking the Luciferic initiation of the Lightbringer, Prometheus, Lucifer, the Solar Logos. They've always been preparing you for him. Their agenda has never changed. But we have been so brainwashed to hate Christianity that the Bible is literally the last place we would look for the truth. Jesus spoke of a time that's coming, and he said, "Now the brother shall betray the brother to death, and the father the son, and children shall rise up against their parents, and shall cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake." Now this is interesting. Here's a guy that not even his enemies can find a good reason to accuse him. He's entirely just and sincere and humble in the Bible. Yet for some unknown reason, what he said is absolutely true. We will be hated for his name's sake. The reason the mere calling on his name crushes whatever force is behind sleep paralysis and so-called alien abductions is because he really is who he claimed to be. And the demons are just as scared of him now as they were during the pages of the Bible. Jesus said in Matthew 11, verse 28, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Mark 10, verse 45 says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Acts 17:30 says, "Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead." I do not think that David Icke knows that he's being used as a tool for the New World Order. I would like to think that he would turn from this if he could be convinced of it. I want to ask you to help me pray for Mr. Icke. For transcripts, footnotes, free downloads, and free DVDs, go to the website davidikedebunked.com. Thanks for your time.